Diamonds in his eyes, kind that you can't see inside your disguise. It's where he wants to be. You think that you're so smart with everything you say, that he can feel your heart in every game you play. Don't talk so loud. You stand on a corner, higher than your heels. Where did you learn to play so rough?
Sally Ann Huckstep purported to be the girlfriend of Warren Lanfranchi. Warren Lanfranchi was circulated by myself and other members of the hold-up squad for quite a few bank robberies, and he was also wanted for the attempted shooting of a police motorcyclist who actually drew alongside them when they were about to arrive at one of the banks that they were going to rob. He was also a suspect for a murder at Wollongong. A drug dealer named Magroda was bashed to death with a baseball bat. When we finally had the showdown with Warren Lanfranchi, up until that point I had never heard of Sally Huckstep until 2 weeks after the showdown with Warren in Dangar Place. She appeared on 60 Minutes and made these unbelievable allegations about that I had murdered Warren Lanfranchi, that I'd obviously stolen money that he had left the home with in his possession, and she made all these other allegations about police impropriety, corruption, etc., etc. But up until that point of time, I had not heard of her at all. Never.
What was she alleging? Tell us what she alleged.
Well, she basically alleged that, I mean, what I said was the truth, and what had happened was the truth. In reality was that I had gone to meet him there with the intention of arresting him. When he realised he was ambushed, which he was, he then attempted to pull a gun. Well, he pulled a gun from the front of his pants. And it was that point of time that I got my gun from the back of my trousers where I had it secreted and fired 2 shots at him and killed him. Now, of course, as I said, the father immediately made allegations of impropriety, and of course then she followed on the 60 Minutes program, she alleged that I had murdered him, that he had left home with $10,000 in cash down the front of his trousers, and that I had obviously stolen that money when I met him in the lane. And when, of course, I heard what Sally Ann Huckstep was saying on that 60 Minutes program, I was utterly shocked. Had numerous phone calls, of course, from all my other workmates who were involved in the whole operation, as well as lawyers telling me that I had been savagely defamed.
Tell me what flowed from that.
I realised that I had been defamed, and in a very short space of time I had lawyers that I knew ringing me, telling me that they had seen the program and that I had been defamed. Now, the Police Association at the time acted for me and for my fellow police officers, and they actually sought an advising from senior counsel who said that I had been defamed, and the Police Association proceeded on my behalf to prosecute or to pursue the defamation proceedings. And after I think the initial paperwork and the lodging of the official papers had been done in the Supreme Court, the association, well, I was contacted personally by a fellow police officer at the time who said that Malcolm Turnbull's solicitor, who was then, I understand, Kerry Packer's personal solicitor when Kerry was in charge of Channel 9 and, of course, the Telegraph, that would I be interested in talking to Malcolm Turnbull in an unofficial way to start with, to see if we could settle, or they could settle, this defamation matter. And of course I agreed, with the consent, of course, of the association lawyers. I went and had a meeting with Malcolm Turnbull. It was a very amicable meeting. I'd never met him before, and we agreed, as I said, in conjunction with the Police Association advising me, on a settlement. And of course, once that settlement was put in place, it remains a secret until this day, and I think that's by law.
You met with Turnbull and Packer?
Yeah.
Can you take me through what they said?
We had the meeting in Malcolm Turnbull's office, and when we agreed on a figure that was suitable all round, I checked with the association, and then Malcolm Turnbull tapped on the window, and I understood right next door was Kerry Packer's office. Kerry Packer came into Malcolm Turnbull's office. We shook hands, and he asked me if I was happy, and I said I was, and in no time at all, you know, they had sent the cheque to the Police Association solicitors.
Paint me a little bit of a picture of Sally Ann. She was the girlfriend of Warren, but she was, what else did she do? What was her background?
Well, of course, as time went by, of course, I got to know a lot about Sally Ann Huckstep, and of course, she was a prostitute. She was a heroin addict herself. She dealt in drugs. She worked King's Cross as a prostitute. I think it was because she was a very attractive and a good-looking little bird that she got a lot of sympathy from different people, including members of the media and the public. But she really was just a typical common prostitute. And of course, continued with his allegations. You know, later on I learnt that she became a police informer for the federal police, and as well as a couple of state police officers, and basically lived that life until she finally died.
Tell me what happened to her. You mentioned she's died. Tell me how she met her end.
Again, I was shocked when I learnt that Sally Ann Huckstep had been murdered here in Centennial Park. And of course, from inquiries that were being made and from what we heard, it soon became obvious that she had been murdered by people who she was close to. And later on, you know, the rumours were getting stronger that Warren Richards, who was a well-known heroin dealer, and Neddy Smith, of course, another heroin dealer as well as an informer of mine and just a bad man about town, were the two culprits who had killed her here in the pond in Centennial Park.
Tell me how she was. I mean, I'm just alluding to the fact that the body was found here. She was floating in the pond. Just tell me how. Give me a description of what had happened to her.
She was found the next morning. I think it was a jogger that was jogging through the park early. Found or saw what looked like a body floating in the pond here. And of course the police were called. And when the body was dragged out of the water and placed on the ground, someone identified her as Sally Ann Huckstep. And it was obvious that she'd been drowned. I think that was the main cause of death, drowning. Her daughter Sasha made allegations, I think, about me to the media. Of course, there was a subsequent coroner's inquest, and I was summoned to attend that. And I was asked what my movements were for on the night in question. And I mean, I remembered it well that I had been to a function at Marylands. It was a police function where there were many, many witnesses who all were interviewed and said, yes, Rogerson was definitely at this function until fairly late in the evening. In regard to Neddy Smith being charged with the murder, Neddy was never called to the inquest. But of course, in the meantime, Neddy was in jail, of course, for armed robbery and this murder charge himself, the main murder, on the tow truck guy. And of course, he then started, I'd say, skiting about all these other murders he'd committed. And subsequently, Task Force Snowy was set up. They put a bug in his cell. And of course, he was heard making these outlandish, well, skiting, you might say, about all these murders that he'd committed. Now, I'm quite sure that some of the murders he said he did, I'm sure he couldn't have done. In regard to the Sally Huckstep murder, he was charged with a murder, but was acquitted. And I think there were a few red herrings thrown across the trial by Winston Terracini, who's a very well-known criminal defence lawyer and does a great job, of course, for what he's paid to do. And of course the jury accepted their story and Neddy was actually acquitted.
Was Ned, in your view, capable of doing that sort of thing?
Absolutely. Ned was very capable of killing her. I mean, he was a big, strong man. I think one of the problems was that Ned I think, alleged that he bashed her and did all sorts of things to her. But I think the subsequent PM that was carried out after she was found here in this lake or in this pond, where there was very little injury to her body. In fact, I think it was drowning that was the main cause of her death, where I think Ned said that he'd bashed her and sort of half broken her neck, and I think there was a fairly big conflict between the actual medical evidence as to what her cause of death was and what Ned was skiting about. And as I said before, Ned skited about it.
Give me your view of why she was killed, why Sally Ann was killed.
Well, I mean, I had long left the cops. Ned was still running around the place, obviously dealing in heroin, as was Warren Richards. She, of course, was a heroin addict. No doubt they were her suppliers, as they had been for maybe many, many years. She, of course, had become an informer. In fact, there's a story going that she actually went with certain police officers to Long Bay Jail and was seen in the jail by prisoners, obviously there to tell the police about certain people in prison. Now, I don't know why that would ever be allowed to happen. It certainly wouldn't have happened in my day, or I wouldn't have allowed that to happen. But I think there was a lot of evidence building up, a lot of information building up, that she was a police informer. It was a well-known thing, and there's no doubt Ned and no doubt Warren Richards would have been concerned that she was talking about them. And that would have been as good a reason that Ned would have needed to kill her. We're in the cellar, which is underneath the Iron Duke Hotel, a famous pub in the middle of Alexandria. And this cellar, I'm absolutely positive from what I've learned in the last 2 or 3 years, holds many stories, and I'm sure there are ghosts right in this building, right in this cellar where we're sitting now, of past criminals who came here alive and never left alive.
Let's just go back a step. What was the gang that used this cellar?
This cellar was basically a godsend for a group of crims who got together and they became known as the Toe Cutter Gang. These guys were very smart crims. They were, and very clever, but they were led by an English gentleman named Linus Patrick Driscoll. Jimmy Driscoll, or Jimmy the Pom as he was known. And this guy originally was involved with the Cray brothers in England, in London, in the East End of London. And originally he was imported into Australia, or into Melbourne more particularly, by the Painters and Dockers Union back in 1967 to keep the peace down there. Now, we've all read books and seen what's happened in recent times about the Painters and Dockers in Victoria. They've always been a troublesome group, and as I said, in 1967 Linus Patrick Driscoll was imported out to Australia, to Melbourne, and paid $1,000 a week. And that's a lot of money back in 1967 to keep the peace between the two warring factions of the Painters and Dockers.
At some stage he comes to Sydney and there's this gang forms. What was their MO? What were they sort of doing?
Linus Patrick Driscoll came to Sydney. He obviously liked the eastern suburbs of Sydney and the beaches area, especially Bondi, far more than he liked St Kilda and the outer parts of Melbourne. Once he came here, he never wanted to go back to Melbourne again. I really can't blame him for that. But in a very short space of time, we were receiving information that certain crims, I'm talking about safe blower type fellows, very smart criminals, they were the aces back in those days, the safe crackers, and 2 or 3 of these guys who'd been charged with up to 30 or 40 safe cracking offences went missing. And then we started to hear rumours that there was a gang called the Toe Cutter Gang. We weren't sure who was involved with it or who had formed it. Now that came a little bit later on when our investigations commenced into a very large armoured van robbery that that occurred in 1970.
Tell me that story. What 1970 was a huge robbery for well now even, but for those days huge. Just take me through what happened.
Right. I think it was March 1970. A main Nicholas armoured van had pulled into a car park at the back of Guildford Shopping Centre, ostensibly so the guards on board could have a lunch break. And whilst they were in the car park, 3 men approached them, all armed with high-powered weapons, held the occupants of the van up, and actually got away with the massive sum back in those days of $587,890. Now, I don't know what it equates to in today's money, but it'd be many millions from 1970 up until today. I was part of a group that was formed, a group of detectives at the CIB to investigate this armed robbery, and I was one of those guys. Within a very short space of time, my mate and myself got information from a Melbourne criminal as to who was responsible. And we went to Melbourne, where we arrested a guy named Steve Nitties, who was known in Melbourne as the Melbourne Bomber. His fun back in those days was setting fire to nightclubs as a bit of a standover thing. But anyhow, we got involved with this armed robbery. Another guy was a bloke named Alan Jones, Alan Laurie Albert Jones, and we identified these guys, and within a reasonable space of time we pinched them and charged them with the armed robbery. Eventually they went for trial and they got 16 years jail each. But of course the rumours were strong about the toe cutter gang, and we had found out that the third guy involved with this armed robbery, his name was Francis Blair, known as Baldy Blair. And anyhow, he was missing. And then we got information that he had been a victim of the toe cutter gang. And what happened there was that he had his share. The three offenders who actually did the armed robbery, they were working for a guy named Leslie Woon, a Chinese criminal who was mainly based in Melbourne, but after this was committed and this robbery was committed, he shot through with basically the bulk of the dough, over 300,000, his share, as he was the mastermind. He went over to England, but we didn't know that at that point. But the three guys, Nitties, Jones and Blair, all got 90,000 each. From our inquiries, we were able to find out the name of an old bookie who lived just down the road from this pub, an old SP bookie. So we went down there and he told us that one day, Baldy Blair, who he knew, had asked him to look after a bag, and it was in an old bookmaker's bag. So he was looking after this bag for Baldy. Some months after, he got a knock at the door and there were 3 guys there, and they said, look, we're here to collect Baldy's bag. He needs it urgently. So he said, it wasn't for me to say no, where's Baldy? He said, I just gave it to him. I handed it over because they seemed to know exactly where it was and what was in it. But there was in fact 90,000. I didn't even know myself there was 90 grand in it. So he said, I very happily gave them the bag so they could piss off and leave me alone. Well then, as those inquiries continued, we learnt that these guys were actually the toe cutter gang, of which Linus Patrick Driscoll, Jimmy Driscoll, was the leader. A guy named Kevin Gore was his offsider. A bloke named Billy Maloney, who was basically just known as a shoplifter, but a very smart one. He was the third toe cutter. And they just disappeared with this guy's money. Baldy Blair was missing, presumed dead, and the information we got was actually that he'd been buried out on the start of the new runways going into Botany Bay, the new extended runways at Mascot Airport.
What were the toe cutters doing? They were basically targeting crims who'd had a very big heist. So they weren't robbing banks. They were robbing. Yeah.
What we learnt was that the toe cutter gang, they targeted the top line criminals, the crims who were earning big money, such as Baldy. 90,000, as I said, was a hell of a lot of money back in 1970. They also targeted a guy named Alamein Francis, who was a very, very clever safe cracker. He was a jeweller by trade. He had very small oxyacetylene bottles, and he knew exactly where to cut on a safe door, where to open it, where to work the relocking devices and keep the door open while he stole the contents. Now, Alamein Francis, together with Kevin Gore, were charged with, I think, 30 safe robberies. Gore finally turned on Alamein Francis, his co-accused, and he became a victim of the toe cutter gang. And then what really blew the thing open for us was that Alan Jones, this guy that we charged in Melbourne with the arm, as one of the offenders of the armed robbery, he wanted to talk to us, and we interviewed him, and he actually told us a horrifying story where these guys had grabbed him when he left a hotel one day, kidnapped him, took him to a hotel near this pub, and then basically threatened him with death if he didn't hand over his money as part of the proceeds of this armed robbery. This is before we charged him, obviously. And but somehow or other he was able to escape. It was actually at the Oceanic Hotel, would you believe, at Randwick. That's where they took him to a room there, and where they threatened him, but he was a big strong bastard, and he was able to get away from them. Now he made sure that he and his family kept well out of the way, and we were able to find him, but it took a fair bit of doing. He was certainly doing his best to hide himself, and I really think he was hiding himself more from the toe cutter gang than the coppers. This was the actual cellar where the toe cutter gang brought their victims. Now, if you look behind me, there is a chute which opens up. So in the old days, the old 18-gallon kegs, the big wooden ones, would be rolled down from there. They'd roll them down or hook them on a rope down the bottom here. Well, the story I got was that they'd open that door up and they just throw them in here, just throw them down here. They couldn't get out of here. Then they'd come in themselves. There was a stainless steel table which was here, and they'd tie them to the table, and then of course they'd start questioning them as to where they had all their money stashed away, all their ill-gotten gains. And of course if they didn't tell them quickly enough, then they'd obviously remove their shoes and socks, and then with the bolt cutters they'd start snipping their toes off one by one by one by one.
What did this bloke tell you? Just if you can, sort of word for word, what did he say to you?
He basically told us exactly what they did, and that was that they would cut their toes off. They would then obviously cut the body up, because as I said, there's never been a trace of any bodies. Now, if you look around this room here, you've got coal rooms, you've got every facility for someone like the toe cutter gang, so they'd be able to put their victims away for the time being and slowly remove them in maybe plastic bags, bit by bit, until they completely disappeared. And I've got no doubt, because the guy that told me was a very, very smart, clever crim himself. He was a very big earner, and I've got no doubt he would have been a target himself of these guys, but was lucky enough to never get into their clutches. But he, of course, because of his position amongst the criminal milieu in Sydney, he knew, I knew when he told me this, he was talking the truth. As I said before, Alan Jones was taken to the Oceanic Hotel at Randwick. The old bookie just lived down the road here. This is a very central place where all these blokes lived, and what a perfect place to do it.
So how many blokes do you reckon might have been thrown through the chute there, whatever you want to call it, and killed in this very room?
I would say that on the information that I was given, as I said, of late by this particular well-known crim, and from what we knew before, from the snippets we were picking up from the crims we were talking to, that up to 8 were thrown through that, came down through that chute, and were tortured here, killed, and their money extracted from them.
And any trace, who were some of those victims? Run through some of the names and whether any trace has been found.
Well, two that I know of for sure, well, three that I know of for sure, were Baldy Blair, of course, having been involved with the main Nicholas armoured van robbery. Alan Main Francis, this guy who was this jeweller who had done all these safe robberies with Kevin Gore. And Kevin Gore himself became a victim of his own gang. These guys were absolutely ruthless in what they were doing, and were very successful at it.
Give me a brief rundown of what happened to the toe cutters, to Linus Driscoll and co.
Yeah. Now, in regard to Linus Patrick Driscoll, or Jimmy Driscoll, as I said before, his main cohort was Billy Maloney, William Maloney, who was basically sort of known as a shoplifter. Now people say, oh, it's a bit of shoplifting, but these blokes didn't just shoplift chocolates and what they shoplifted fur coats and jewellery and very expensive items. They were very, very smart and clever, and travelled the world at one stage as shoplifters, and confounded the cops, I know, in England and in America. They were just too smart for the local police with their shoplifting ability. But Billy Maloney, amazingly enough, he had a brother, John Patrick Maloney, known as Jake Maloney. Now, he was a shoplifter as well, sort of hung around the eastern suburbs. For some reason, Jake Maloney ended up renting a house out in Viga Street, Revesby. And one particular morning, a neighbour who was calling out for him during the night went into the house that Jake was renting, and discovered Jake lying dead in the toilet at the back of the house, and called the police. I was sent out there with my mate to investigate Jake's murder, and in a very short space of time we were able to tie up his association with Linus Patrick Driscoll, this leader of the toe cutter gang. Now, some years had passed, of course, since the toe cutter gang got really busy and killed all their victims, and by this point of time, Jimmy Driscoll was living at Oatley in a rented house with a couple of strange young fellows. And when the forensic people did the post-mortem on Jake Maloney, they found that he had been shot 3 times in the head with what looked like, in such quick succession, that they thought it had to be some sort of a machine-type pistol. Now, the story we were picking up at that point of time was that Linus Patrick Driscoll, the toe cutter gang leader, he had in possession a number of, well, they were machine pistols. They were a Javam-based .22, where a fitter and turner out at, I think it was Stanmore, had modified these guns. He'd cut the barrel down, he'd threaded the end and had made the silencer to fit on the end. He adjusted the mechanism so that once you pull the trigger, it was like a machine gun fire, and it just kept it activated until whatever was contained in the magazine, it fired through the mechanism. And he had a double-sized magazine, which meant that he could fire off about 50 shots. Now, using subsonic ammo, .22 ammo, that basically made no sound at all. He could just pull away on this thing, and it just, well, as I said, his nickname was the Silent One. And we assumed from the forensic report that Jake had been killed by one of these guns. Our investigations led us to Oatley. By this point of time, Driscoll had gone missing. He'd left the location, and we had no idea where he was. These 2 young fellows he was living with had no idea. But we dug up the back lawn. They told us he used to sit on a chair on the back veranda and fire this machine pistol constantly into the backyard, and just over and over again, just day after day, fire away. Now, we took the ballistics guys out there, and Bruce Gibson, who ended up becoming assistant commissioner, but Bruce was then a sergeant on the ballistics unit. Bruce and I dug up this back lawn one afternoon, and might have been a whole day we spent there, and we found hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bullets that he'd fired into the dirt, into the grass, and then into the dirt, as well as, of course, that he was discharging cartridge cases And of course we found hundreds of those all around the place. And of course they were the same as the ones that were, well, the bullets were identified as from the same gun that had been used to kill Jake Maloney. So we knew he was identified as Linus Patrick Driscoll in the house, having been witnessed many times by these two young fellows firing this weapon aimlessly into the ground. And we had, of course, the bullets that had been removed from Jake's body identified from the same gun. So we kept going with the investigation, and finally we actually found the gun. Someone came forward and said that they'd seen a man throw what looked like an umbrella or a gun or something into Bondi Beach at Ben Buckler. And we sent the police divers down there, and after a few days of searching, they actually found the machine pistol that had been used to murder Jake Maloney. So we had the gun, and we had the bullets, and we had him identified by these guys that he lived with. So we had a pretty fair brief on him. All we had to do was find him. And we finally tracked him down to Melbourne. He was found there, and he had a huge catch of guns. He had machine guns and shotguns, and he had a huge great tank just full of guns. And I can always remember when my workmate asked Linus Patrick Driscoll, well, what was he doing with all these guns? I can always remember his answer. He said, well, tools of trade, Mr. Morey. Tools of trade, tools of trade. And became a very important part, of course, in the court case. But he was extradited to Sydney. He was charged and he was convicted. He spent 6 years, but in that time, someone finally put an appeal together to the High Court, and the High Court finally overturned the conviction, and he was released. The next thing that happened with Linus was that he went up to the Gold Coast. He held up SeaWorld up there, committed a robbery. Somehow Neddy Smith found out about it. Ned told me. I told the police, the detectives on the Gold Coast. They rearrested Linus. He was charged with that armed robbery. I think served a further sentence and then was deported. Well, actually he was deported, I'm sorry. He was deported after he was acquitted of the murder charge. I've left that bit out. So he was, after 6 years, the High Court acquitted him. He was then deported to England, and then he slipped back into the country. He held up SeaWorld on the Gold Coast. Somehow Ned Smith found out about it, told me that he'd done it. I rang the police, they found him up there, charged him with it, and he was convicted and I think served a further jail term, and I think got deported again. I don't know where he is now, but he'd be well in his 70s if he's still alive.
This cellar's not only well known for toe cutter gang, but also there's another story attached to it, isn't there? Tell me that. What happened?
There's another story to do with this cellar, and it involves Ned. For everyone who's watched Blue Murder, there's a scene there where you see Ned and Richard Rocks were playing me, and I think Abbo Henry and I think Chris Flannery, and we're all down here firing with our machine guns and shotguns and handguns and all sorts of guns. And if you look behind me again, you'll see the wall there, and there are bullet holes still there. They've been left after all those years. Now, there's something always made me think that Ned Smith knew more about this cellar than what he'd never ever spoken about it to me ever. But like the guy that told me the story about the toe cutter gang using this, I'm sure that probably Ned would have heard the same story. But that's one story that he never ever told me. But certainly they used to come down here and fire away and think they were, wide earth and they were out in the bloody wild, wild west. But the proof of that shooting is there on the wall, which you can see. Plenty of bullet holes still there, and no doubt they'll be there for the rest of time.
Were you, tell me, you were portrayed as being down here. Did you have your machine gun down here, Roger?
No. So well, maybe fortunately or unfortunately, I probably would have enjoyed it. But I was never invited to come down here. I only came down here of recent times, basically after I got the story from this crim telling me about the toe cutter gang. I really didn't believe that the bit about in Blue Murder where Ned and the gang are down here shooting, but of course once I saw the bullet hole, and then I spoke to someone else who then confirmed, yes, that they used to come down here and use this as a target for target practice. We're now standing in Jemeric Road at Rose Bay. In the very late 70s, we had a siege here, just up the road from where we're now standing, where a policeman, a detective, was shot and lucky to have lived, and an armed robber was shot dead. A well-known criminal named Gordon Pierce Thomas, who'd spent a fair bit of time in Long Bay Jail, decided to go back to committing armed robberies. So he decided to rob a bank in Bondi Junction this particular morning, and when he was given all the money by the tellers happened to place 2 scorpion devices. Now these scorpion devices are little explosive devices held together in a wad of $5 or $10 notes, and they're held together with a clip. And when the teller puts them in the robber's bag, there's about a 3 or 4 minute time delay before they explode, and aniline dye, when they do explode, spreads out over all the notes and everything else, and destroys the money. It was a great idea, and I think they're now using them in ATMs. It's an old invention, but now being used again. This guy, having robbed the 2 tellers at this bank, they gave him 2 scorpion devices. He was a pretty smart robber. He left the scene of the robbery and jumped into a taxi. He didn't have a getaway car or a bloke waiting outside. He just jumped into a taxi and told the taxi driver to head towards the city. Well, of course, he wanted to see how much money he had in his bag, and sitting in the back of the taxi, he opened the bag up, and within a few seconds of him opening the bag up, the 2 scorpion devices exploded, and green aniline dye completely covered him, completely destroyed the money, went over all the inside of the taxi as well as the back of the taxi driver's head and the seat and everything else. He then panicked, of course. He pulled out a .22 rifle out of the bag, which he'd used to commit the armed robbery, and pointed at the back of or stuck it against the back of the driver's head and told him to drive where he directed him to. And he directed him down here to Rose Bay. And he got to New South Head Road, which is just up the top here, and he then jumped out of the taxi. And he ran down to the waterfront, and he ran along the shores of Rose Bay, and he found, at that point of time, he looked to the east, looked towards the harbour bridge, and saw helicopters heading towards him, choppers heading towards him. And he thought, shit, they're bloody police choppers, for sure. And he was fully exposed on the beach here at Rose Bay. So he saw this house with a great huge hedge at the back of it, and he decided to seek cover in there. So he ran through the hedge, ran through an opening into the hedge, and then when he's run through the hedge, he's ended up in the backyard, and it happened to be the home of John Singleton, and he was then still married to Maggie Eckhart, and Maggie happened to be sunning herself alongside the swimming pool in the backyard. Well, of course, she's heard this movement coming through the bush, and realised she's seen this green monster, and that's exactly what he was. He was completely covered in green dye. She's absolutely shit herself. He never said anything to her. He just ran straight past her. He ran through the house and back out onto New South Head Road, and then he turned left and he came up here into Jemeric Road. Now, having entered into Jemeric Road, he was looking for somewhere again to hide. The choppers were in the area above him because we'd been notified. Maggie Eckhart had actually rung the police and told the police what had happened, told VKG. So we were right in the air. We were expecting this bloke to strike. So we had quite a few cars right in the area. Anyhow, so he's looked down to Merrick Road, and he's found a block of 3 units, 3 flats they would be called back in those days: ground floor, first floor, second floor. And he's run straight to the top floor, and he's kicked the door straight in. And of course, the neighbours have heard this commotion, and of course they've rung the police, so we knew. I mean, the trail continued. So suddenly, we've got a siege situation right in this street. Police from the emergency squad were called, or the Special Weapons and Operations squad were called here. We were already on site. And so we surrounded we contained the perimeter. We called in a hostage negotiator. Nelson Chaddett happened to be. And really it was an unbelievable experience to see what happened after that. Suddenly the top windows of this flat, the windows of this flat opened up, and suddenly out came all the furniture. The 3-in-1 television set came out, the radiogram and what have you came flying through the window, crashed down on the grass beneath. The washing machine came out, the dish, the dryer, all the furniture, and finally even the toilet bowls. He'd snapped the toilet bowls in the bathroom and in the toilet, and out they came, straight down, crashed down below. So of course it was a serious situation, and we couldn't let this go on for too long. So finally it was decided that we'd have a group of police, of SWAS men, who would go into this unit and take him. So we had the periphery at the top surrounded. We had a couple of sharpshooters, a couple of SWAS sharpshooters there with Seiko sniper rifles, and so I wasn't part of that team this day. I was at the back of the place with Bob Myers, but we had a team led by Billy Bull, who was then a detective sergeant, and so this team crashed through the front door, went into the house. They had protective clothing on best they could, vests and what have you. And so this guy, as soon as he saw Bill Bull and the team behind him, he grappled with Bill Bull and a fight ensued. Now Bill Bull was armed with an Armalite rifle, an M16. And during that violent struggle, Bill Bull, somehow this guy got his hand on the trigger and a shot was fired and Bill was hit in the groin area, and very lucky to have survived. We had a sharpshooter, one of the SWAS guys, with a Seiko rifle, looking through his scope, saw exactly what happened, didn't waste another second, fired and shot this guy, Gordon Pierce Thomas, in the head and killed him. Killed him instantly, and that obviously saved Bill Bull's life. Bill Bull was taken to hospital, and we were very concerned about him because we really thought that he'd probably be a fatal injury, but getting hit with an M16 is a pretty serious business, but he survived and went on to bigger and better things. We were in the area, of course, as I've said, and so the first call we got was that he'd been sighted in the rear of John Singleton's home. Maggie Eckhart had rung the police, so we raced down and saw her, and she told us what had happened, that he'd run through the front of the house and obviously gone to the left, which meant heading up towards Demerrick Road. We put that over the police radio. We called as many cars as we could into the area saying, you know, giving his description, looking for this green monster, carrying a bag with green money and a green gun. That basically, everything was green that day. The Greenies will be very happy with the description that day of this man named Gordon Pierce Thomas, this armed robber. So, as I said, it was contained very quickly because he realised he was exposed out on New Southhead Road, exposed down on the beach, found this top unit, crashed into it, and then of course he realised that he was stuffed anyhow because the neighbours had given him up. Everyone had rung and said, you know, they'd heard noises. Within a very short space of time, we could see him moving about in the top flat, and of course we surrounded the place, and then that was it. We contained the area, we called in the extra SWAT guys, we called in the ballistics blokes, and the rest is history.
What was he doing throwing all the stuff out of the window? What was the last one promise? Was he mad? Was he just agitated? Was he...
I was given the brief later on I was given the job by Detective Inspector Morey of putting the brief together for the coroner's court. And it often crossed my mind as to why he threw all this stuff out, all this furniture and stuff there. But it was a question I was never able to ask him because unfortunately he was dead. So we really were never able to find out why he threw all this stuff out, but he certainly completely and utterly destroyed the inside of this flat. There wasn't one thing in it that he hadn't thrown out the window. As I said, he'd even actually broken the toilet bowls off the concrete plinth they were on and thrown them out just for good measure. He was just completely off his head. And later on, checking on his background, he just was a raving schizophrenic, a raving ratbag. Raving ratbag. Bushy Burns, his real name was Lawrence John Burns. Now I'd locked him up for a few bank robberies. He used to work at the Whale Car Wash at Bondi Junction on night shift. He used to wash police cars and taxis. But during the day, when he was running a bit short of money, he'd do the odd bank robbery. And he did 3 or 4, just by himself. And anyhow, someone gave him up, and we arrested him and charged him with the bank robberies, and he pleaded guilty. And I can't remember the sentence, but he would have got at least 7 or 8 on the bottom, I'd imagine. So you think, well, that's a pest off the streets for a while, you forget about him. Anyhow, maybe 2 or 3 years went by, and I had an informer who was then pretty active, and he saw me this day, and he asked me if I knew Butchie Burns, and I said yes, that I knew him. And I asked him why, and he said, well, look, he said, I think he's going to rob South Sydney Junior Leagues Club. Oh, that's interesting. I said, well, how's he going to do it? He said, well, he's found out that every Sunday morning the Leagues Club have an old combi bus, and about 5 minutes to 10, it leaves the old South Sydney Junior Leagues Club, and it's got half a dozen old blokes in it. A lot of them are old retired cops. He thought one may have had a gun with them, but what they did, the club put all the notes that were taken from the poker machines and their activities on the Friday and Saturday nights into bank bags. And then Sunday morning, as I said, 5 to 10, they'd throw all these bank bags in the back of this old combi with all these old guys, some old cops amongst them. And the combi bus would chug up to the rural bank in Anzac Parade at Kingsford. And then the old guys would stand across the footpath, and one would open up the night safe, and they'd pass the bags along until they were all put into the night safe. I said, oh yeah, well, I said, how much money's supposed to be in this? He said, well, he thinks there's about $250,000, which in those days was a lot of money. So anyhow, he was going to find out a bit more for me. So the following Sunday, I took a few guys out from the armed hold-up squad, and we took up observation, and sure enough, right at 10 o'clock, the old combi bus chugged up from the roundabout, the Nine Ways roundabout, to the bank, and the old guys got out, and they did exactly what this informer told me would happen. So then he came back to me, and he said, look, he said, probably won't happen for maybe a week or 2, but he said, I'll let you know. He's definitely going to do it. So sure enough, he rang me on the Thursday or the Friday before the Sunday, and he said he's going to do it. So we got in position. I had detectives from the CIB on either side of Anzac Parade. I was with my workmate, old Arnie Tees, unfortunately passed away some years ago. Arnie and I were in Lawrence Dry Cleaners right next to the bank. And as I said, we had the whole place covered. We had uniformed blokes down on the corner of at the roundabout who would block the traffic off once the combi bus came past, and then we had some uniformed blokes up near the Doncaster Hotel, and just in case there was a bad situation, and so stop the traffic from coming down. So as I said, right at 10 o'clock, we're all in position. Right at 10 o'clock, the old combi bus rolled up. And out got the old guys, and they got across the footpath, and they were just starting to pass the bags out when suddenly this V8 Valiant roared up at 100 mile an hour and screeched to a halt, and out jumped Butchie Burns and a guy in the back, a little mousy Markham, and anyhow, of course they're armed with guns, and so they're holding up the old guy saying, give us the bags, give us the bags. Anyhow, of course, Arnie and I came out of the Lawrence Dry Cleaners next door. Butchie recognised me because I'd arrested him, and he was standing right near the car. So he's dived back into the front door of the car. Mousy was jumped in the back, and of course the car took off at 100 mile an hour. But as before he jumped back in the car, of course he's got the shotgun, and I've got a shotgun. He was pointing the gun at us and the old fellows, and of course I actually thought he was going to fire at us. So Arnie and I sort of simultaneously fired our guns. We both hit Butchie. He's fallen back into the car, and then the car, as I said, has taken off at high speed. Well, of course, all the other detectives either side of Anzac Parade, they said, well, here's Rogerson and Arnie Tees, they're firing guns at these blokes. We might as well have let a few shots go. So they've hit this old Valiant, and it's been hit with shotgun and mainly shotgun pellets and 38, Smith & Wesson 38 bullets. By the time it got to the Doncaster Avenue turn off to the right, it looked like your mother's colander. It had a million holes in it. The windscreen had been shot out, the windows, the back window, the tyres. It was running on the rims by the time it got to the Doncaster Avenue, because I couldn't see that, but because I've told about it later, and because I saw the car and I realised what state it was in. So as I screeched around to the right, the car sort of came to a sudden stop, basically hit the gutter, and the door, which Butchie had sort of fallen back into, had never shut, but the speed of the car kept the door sort of close to the body. Well, of course, once the car came to a screeching halt, the door swung open, Butchie fell out into the gutter, dead as a doornail. Now, there's a lesson to be learnt. Butchie, would you believe, Butchie, as I told you before, I'd locked up for these armed robberies. I didn't want to make too many inquiries about him because the information I knew was spot on. But of course, then I found out after this incident had occurred and Butchie was dead. When I checked with Corrective Services, I found Butchie was on work release. And Butchie had been on work release for quite some time, and Butchie worked for a painting contractor, and he'd leave Silverwater every Monday morning and go back every evening. And so on the Thursday or the Friday, before this armed robbery, because he needed to be out on the Sunday, so he put an application in to the jail authorities saying that his boss needed him to work on the Sunday on this painting job. And of course they let him go, let him out to go and finish the painting job. Now, as I said, like had he told the truth and told the governor of the of Silverwater that, look, I'm actually going to do an armed robbery on Sunday, Governor, and I'd like you to let me out, you'd like to think the governor of the jail would have said, no, Butchie, you're in for armed robbery, it's no good for your rehabilitation. We're not going to let you do it. But of course he didn't say that. He told a lie, filled the form in incorrectly. Maybe there's a lesson to be learned, and you should always fill in forms correctly and honestly, especially when you're doing your tax. And probably be alive today had he not told lies to get out of jail on that Sunday to commit this armed robbery. But had he been successful, he would have got away with $250,000, which was then a hell of a lot of money.
There was any regrets about any of that? Was he was a bad guy? He got what he deserved?
Well, he got it. I've never heard a comment since. You know, there was an inquest into his death. He was on work release. Of course, Corrective Services don't get in trouble for things like that. I think I actually rang Ron Woodham, who's now the current commissioner. I think I actually rang him that day and told him, you know, the bad news about one of his clients, and he said, "Oh well, you know, these things happen, Roger," and blah blah blah. But no, and as I said, it happened. He got shot dead, and that was it. That was it. As I said, the inquest occurred. I don't think there was any comment or much complaint, or no complaint at all from his relatives. That was the end of Butchie.
These were the streets where some of the brothels were. Who ran the brothels around here?
Well, Joe Borg was the main offender. Joe Borg was a Maltese guy who'd been here for some years, and he basically owned all the brothels in this East Sydney area. He ran them, and they were all little houses, all little places. Of course, it's all been gentrified now. They're all owned by trendy people. It's very handy to the city, and I'd imagine that half the people would never know that the places they were living in were actually brothels.
So Joe was a big wheel. He made a lot of money.
Joe was a big wheel and made a lot of money. He lived out of Bondi. Anyhow, he had a falling out with someone who was obviously trying to stand over him for dough who wouldn't pay him. And so next thing, he had I can remember, it was a 1963 Holden ute. And this morning he got into his ute to start it up and it exploded. A bomb had been planted under it. And Jack Steele was immediately suspected of having organised the bomb because Jack was a standover man. He was actually a safe blower. He was also an informer, very tough man, but in that ilk of person. And so he was an unknown suspect. I didn't work on this case personally myself, but I knew a fair bit about it because the guys working on it came to Noel Morey and myself to help them with some information that they wanted and which we were able to supply them. But they ended up charging, there were two Maltese guys who actually knew Joe Borg very well, a bloke named Attard and another guy named Mifsud, Paul Mifsud. And I think it was Paul Attard, to be quite truthful. And they were charged, and the guy who made the bomb was a guy named Keith Keelaw. Now he had this a very unusual nickname, the Jitterbug Kid. And in fact he was a clever jitterbug performer. So the three of them were charged. Jackie Steele was never charged because he had actually been shot, and I think it was again all the retribution with Borg, etc., etc. Tit for tat situation. And Jackie Steele, I remember seeing Jackie Steele 1 week before he died. He lived in Curlewa Street, Bondi. I went up there to see him with Noel, and he died a week or so later. But the other three, they were found guilty of murder, of the murder of Joe Borg, and got a life sentence. And that was sort of the end of things. I think that the government realised that these places were now getting out of control. That the original control that the police had was starting to wane, so they changed the law and made it illegal, unlawful for these places to operate as brothels, and they all closed down. Now, the worst thing about it was, of course, that those brothels, no one, the old moles or the old prostitutes used to pride themselves on the fact that no bloke ever caught anything in any of their places. They were meticulous with their little short-time towels, as they call them. They used to boil them up and hang them on the line out the back. And the girls there was a doctor at King's Cross, and they all were regularly examined, and there was no syphilis, no gonorrhea. Of course, we didn't have AIDS back in those days, but you could pretty well bet that you wouldn't catch anything if you went there to have a root. And that was something really fantastic. Well, now, once those places were closed and all these girls started working on the streets, well then of course the hygiene basically just dissipated, and suddenly there was a huge upsurge in these syphilis, gonorrhea, these venereal diseases. Now there's Chapel Street. Now this is dead set one of the brothels. We're right in the brothel area now, and this is Woods Lane off here. So we finally found the right place. Can we squeeze through there?
You can.
Well, I think we're right, aren't we? Yeah.
Yeah, you're right this side, mate.
Yeah. Well, the paddy wagon used to come, the bicycle truck would come down here. Now this is Woods Lane, and then that street was the main brothel street, right? Every one of those doorways was a brothel, both sides, and this used to be crowded with guys, like Fridays and Saturday nights especially. There'd be thousands of blokes who'd come up here and go up there and perv on all the girls, and then very few would go in and have a root, but there was a lot of perving went on. I think a little bit of playing with each other Well, this
I've
pub.
been there for a while.
No, this was a good pub. We would occasionally have a beer here. I think we. This is the old Fitzroy. I think I've been down here with Bumper Farrell to have a beer. We'd come down from Darlow and have a beer there. I think there was an old girl that used to run the pub, and we'd pop down with Bumper after when we got to work on Friday afternoon. If I was working on the Vice Squad, I'd catch. Well, Bumper had gone, but Bumper used to drink there, and drink with some of the old Vice Squad blokes.
What was he like, Bumper?
I found him a terrific bloke. Actually, he was a. You know, he had this reputation. He'd bitten a bloke's ear off, and he said he couldn't have done it because he didn't have his teeth. He had his top plate out. That was his story, and he was sticking with it. As I said, I remember him later on when he actually was the inspector in charge of Darlinghurst, and he he used to get ministerial files, you know, about complaints from some idiot who'd been given a clip over the ear or something, and Bumper just used to rip them up and burn them. He'd just put them straight in the fucking garbage bin. Straight in the bin. He couldn't give a stuff. And did I tell you the story about Bumper when he was working security down at Holt Street? Ida Budrose, I think at that point she was the I think the editor-in-chief of the Sunday Telegraph. I was working at Darlinghurst. Bumper was, as I said, working security there. He still used to wear his old police pants, police braces, and boots. So he rang me up and said, "Bumper here, Roger." He said, "Can you come and see me? Ida Budrose has got a problem." So, okay, but I went down. And he took us in to meet Ida. And Ida had some bloke who was in love with her. He was sending her chocolates, flowers, and it was really getting on her nerves. And she'd gone to the local police at Rose Bay, and they sort of said, "Oh yeah, we'll fix this up." Well, nothing happened. So she complained to Bumper, and Bumper said, "Well, leave it to me. I know a couple of blokes at Darlow." He said, "I'll get them to come down and see her." So he got me at work, and I went down, and he told me what the problem was. We met Bumper. We met Ida, and we got all the details off her. And so we never told Ida what we did, but it was just a matter of going and seeing this bloke and saying, "Listen, mate, do you like breathing? If you do, just stop doing what you're doing. Otherwise you probably won't be breathing anymore." Words to that effect. That was the end of it. And that was it. He was just a jerk. But she was wrapped, and she kept saying to Bumper, "I'd love to know what Roger and John actually did. What did they actually do?" He said, "Ida, I can't tell you." But it always works. Philip Weston, a different character altogether. Philip Weston was actually a New Zealander, and the last thing that he'd done in New Zealand was set fire to Mount Eden Jail in Auckland. And I think that they then said, "Well, look, we don't really need you in New Zealand, you better go to Australia." I think they were happy to see the end of him. So he came to Australia, and his mother came over with him. Her name was Alice Blossom Weston, would you believe? Alice Blossom Weston. And I got to know him very well later on because I saw her at the coroner's inquest. But he got with a real bad bunch of guys, and they were concentrating on Bank of New South Wales banks, or Westpac as they became. And they knocked off a Westpac bank in Allison Road at Randwick, right just before Christmas. In fact, the day they held up this bank, it was the day of the Armed Hold-Up Squad annual Christmas party. And it really annoyed us to think that our Christmas party at the old Rusty Shovel at Kensington RSL Club was going to be mucked up because we had this huge robbery. Shots were fired. There was about $100,000 pinched. So we had to do something about it. So we're all out there, and it sort of mucked up our night. But we were determined, because of that happening, that we would dead set get these bastards who knocked off the bank on our Armed Hold-Up Squad Christmas function night and messed our night up. So within a few days of this investigation, we got some terrific information as to who was responsible. And I actually flew down to Griffiths with Arnie Tees, who was my workmate then. We got the last flight out of Sydney to Griffiths on New Year's Eve. And anyhow, we got down to Griffiths, and the guy who was I suppose he was the weak link, was a guy named Robert Rowland Patton, and he was actually a butcher by trade, but he was a bit of a car buff, and he'd done a bit of car racing, and Western had picked him out to be the getaway car driver for all these armed robberies. And what they used to do, they had a set of lockpicks which someone had got from America. They used to go to the airport and they'd go to the long-term car park, and they'd pick either Fairlanes or Falcon, mainly, or GT, Falcon GTs, but Fairlanes or Falcons with the big, powerful V8 engines, 351s, and they'd use the lockpicks to just pick the door. Once they got the door open, of course, they held the lockpicks tight and they put that straight into the ignition, and of course they got the car going. And Western taught Robert Patton how to knock these cars off. So they knocked a heap of cars off for their robberies, and Patton, as I said, he was the driver. So I went down to Griffiths with Arnie Tees. Bob Patton had actually told his mum and dad that he said, "I'm sick of living in Griffiths as a butcher. I've got a job in Sydney as a butcher." Suddenly he's telling them how great it is in Sydney. It was like Dick Whitney when he went to London. You know, the streets were paved with gold or whatever. And suddenly he's telling his mum and dad how fantastic it is living in Sydney. He bought himself a Mustang, a Mach 2 Mustang, or a Mach 1 Mustang. So he's gone home for New Year's Eve with the Flash Mustang, a heap of dough, to say how good things were in the butchery business in Sydney. So Arnie and I, as I said, have gone to Griffiths, and we've got the local blokes involved, the local detectives. We had to bugger up their New Year's Eve parties, but they were all keen to help us. So we've gone to this party, and we've arrested Patton. He's a great big fellow, big lump of a bloke, and took him back to Griffiths Detective Office, and I said to Arnie, like, "Well, I'll crack this bloke." I said, "You blokes get outside." And so I reckon I could crack this bloke in 10 minutes. So I told him how tough I was, and from the CIB, and we weren't down there mucking around for nothing. He wouldn't want to know in a few minutes I'd actually cracked him. He was like a bloody great big, huge man, had him almost crying. But he opened up, he confessed immediately, he dobbed all the others in, including Weston and the other two guys. And anyhow, I rang Sydney, of course, and they were wrapped in the fact that he'd cracked, and we knew all about the others and where they were. So we then, as I said, it's New Year's Eve, it's about midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning by this point of time. We've got cars, we had to get blokes to come down from Sydney, and we actually drove him back. We ferried the Mustang back, and I got in the back of a police car with him, handcuffed to me, and we drove all the way back from Griffiths to Sydney. He talked the whole time through, he cracked, he fully admitted everything, and then from there we arrested the others, including Philip Weston. We got him over at North Sydney. He was a very, very strange, horrible person. And like what happens today sometimes, they all went before a court on separate occasions, because we got Philip Weston a bit after the others. Philip Weston had a lawyer, I think it might have been Tony Bellanto, appeared. Went before a bit of a soft magistrate, and Philip Weston was granted bail. You wouldn't believe it. We were disappointed. They even had an investigation later into it because they were so shocked to think that he got bail. So having got granted bail, well, what did we do? We didn't have to wait long. Within a few days, he decided himself to go into the National Bank in Church Street, Parramatta, the main National Bank in Parramatta, by himself, with a bag and with a 357 Magnum. He walked into the bank, held up the three tellers that were working at the time, And while he was holding them up, standing there with a gun, and they were filling up his bag with money, the manager, whose office was actually in the main bank chamber, like in the public area, realised something was wrong. His door was sort of ajar, opened the door a bit, realised there was this bloke standing there with a gun holding up 3 of his staff, his tellers. So the manager, like most managers, or every manager back in those days, had a bank-issued firearm. He's grabbed his little firearm from the top drawer of his desk, and he's walked out into the chamber. He stuck the pistol into Philip's back and said, "Right, I'm the bank manager, you're under arrest, drop your gun." We had no idea what this bloke was like. Weston has just turned around, and then with the 357 Magnum, point blank range, just stuck it in his guts, fired about 3 or 4 shots and blew him away. Just died on the floor of the bank. Now this bloke was then the youngest manager ever appointed as a National Bank manager. He had 3 young children, 3 or 4 young children, and his life was ended by trying to be a hero. And no one can knock him for that. But of course there was hell to play, because then the media got onto the fact that this bloke was granted bail, and he should never have been granted bail, and he now not only committed another armed robbery, he'd actually murdered a bank manager. So there was a lot of pressure on us to track him down. So we tracked him down to Avoca Beach for a lot of effort from all the police involved, and we went up there and we identified him as Philip Weston. We knew positively it was him. We'd arrested him, etc., etc. So the next morning, this was only a couple of days after, what had happened was he'd gone on to one of his friends, and he'd found this place. It was a little cottage. It's still there now at Avoca Beach. Between holiday units, this house is right on the beach, a little brick cottage. So we've got a team of guys, all the SWAT members of the CIB. We took a great team up there, surrounded the place, hit it with as much tear gas as we could, absolutely filled it up with tear gas. He went into the bathroom, and I was actually, my position was on the right-hand side, facing the bathroom, with a shotgun. I had 2 other guys with me, and as they do on TV, once the tear gas goes in, they go into the bathroom, they put the wet towels under the doors to stop the thing. Well, he did exactly what they do on TV. And we knew he couldn't last for too long. There was that much tear gas going in there. So not long after, we're waiting. We're only 6 feet away. We're just across from the fence. There was a 5-foot dividing fence, 5-foot high dividing fence. And this being an old brick house, it had the typical bathroom windows, you know, with the shaving cabinet in the middle and little windows either side. And so while we're watching, just waiting, we saw what looked like the barrel of a gun being put against the top section of the bottom sash. And of course we were on alert then, and slowly we saw the window going up a little bit. You could see the gas was coming out. We were getting a whiff ourselves. But up went the window, bit more, and suddenly up came his head. And of course he saw us. You could see there was instantly trying to get the gun out the window. Well, we didn't give him half a second. We all fired, and we blew his head off. And the funny thing about it was that you could call it funny, but his body, of course, was finally taken to the city morgue, and his old mum, Alice Blossom Weston, could only identify her son by his big toes. He'd had ingrown toenails. He was this long, gawky guy. He was about nearly 7 foot tall, I suppose, maybe 6 foot 6 tall. Long and skinny. He had feet miles long, with his great long toes and long toenails, and they'd ingrown over the years, so they had to operate on his toes, on his big toes, to take the nails off. So she actually identified his body by his big toes, or what was left of him, but because there was nothing left of his head.
No regrets about that. He was a bad man. Bad.
I got to know as I said, he got to know his mum. We had the coroner's inquest, of course, and she sort of just had to cop it on the chin that her son was a violent, horrible person who'd actually murdered a bank manager, and that was an absolutely shocking crime at the time.
We've discussed the Lanfranchi one. That's 3, and I can't remember if you've mentioned this to me before, but I think you're the only police officer that's shot dead 3 criminals.
Well, you could say other than for maybe other than for Dirty Harry, the Dirty Harry movies. I know I would be the only cop in the history of any police force in Australia who has actually been in a situation where I have been involved in the death of 3 criminals in the line of duty, killing them whilst trying to arrest them. Now, you might say, oh, that sounds horrible, wicked, but don't forget, I mean, I was at the Armed Hold-Up Squad for almost 10 years, and we were out every day. We carried shotguns in the boot of our cars. We carried flak jackets. We were out every day dealing with armed, violent men. That was our job. We didn't have time to call on backup groups like they've got today. They call in this group and that group and tactical response group. I said I've even got it looks like an armoured van themselves. You know, we just had fast cars to get to a scene ourselves. We trusted each other implicitly. We knew we could trust our mates to back us up, to watch our backs, and that's how we work. So, I mean, the only reason I think that I was in a situation where, yes, I was involved in the shooting of 3 guys was because of the work we were constantly doing. When you're dealing with vicious, violent men, it's got to happen that they're going to be, you know, they're going to be firing at you and you're going to be firing at them. They're going to be resisting arrest. It was part of the job, and we liked what we were doing.
Did you consider yourself a Dirty Harry style character? You mentioned Dirty Harry.
Well, I didn't back in those days, but of course in retrospect you think back about all these things that happened to you. And as I said, I'm sure that Clint Eastwood, or playing Dirty Harry, he'd be the only cop I know in the world that's probably, you know, shot a few more than me. I think he might have got up to 7 or 8. But they stopped me from doing that when they transferred me.
You mentioned the green light and that stuff that Ned claims you gave him that. What's your story?
Ned, of course, in his book talked about the green light, which he says that he got from me. Now, he says it was basically after he gave false evidence at the Lanfranchi inquest, which, of course, took place in late October, November 1981. Now, of course, what I've talked about so far is, of course, knowing Ned from 1976, whenever it was, when he first became involved with the Fielders Baker robbery. Now, of course, the Lanfranchi case was a perfect example of me using Ned for the reason that I had him. In regard to the shooting of Lanfranchi, of course, Ned played a very prominent role in his demise, the lead up to his demise. He was the one who had contacted me saying he had Frenchie wanted to talk to me about doing some deal, doing business over what we wanted to talk to him about. And as I said, there was no deal because he was a bloke probably wanted for murder, attempted murder of a policeman for sure, and bank robberies. Well, when of course the inquest came, it was an inquest with a jury, and there was a lot of publicity given to it. And of course Ned had made a statement. He made a statement to other senior officers at the CIB about his involvement and what happened that day. And of course he gave evidence according to his statement and according to his version, which he says was the truth on that occasion. Of course, sometime later, when things really turned bad for Ned, and he was charged over the Flavelle murder, and then of course pinched in his own area here again, knocking off South Sydney Council's payroll. Of course, the true Ned actually showed up again, because here he was wanting to talk about things and talk about people and dob people in and tell lies about people, and this is exactly what he did. And in regard to me, of course, he then said that he gave false evidence in the Lanfranchi inquest because he had to, and in payment for that false evidence, that we then gave him the green light. And I think in reality he named Brian Harding and myself as the two guys who said, well, Ned, you've got the green light to do anything you like except kill people. Well, he didn't take our word too seriously, because I mean, he then was skiding later in jail about killing 12 or 14 people. He didn't take our advice too well. But getting back to a serious note, Ned said we gave him the green light. Now we go back now to Ned's one of his books, where he says this green light came into effect when he started doing these large payrolls. Now, these are his words, and you go back to the facts and history. Those large payrolls, robberies that he committed with Abbo Henry, where they were both given indemnity so they could freely talk about them, did not happen until 1986. Now, my last day of active days in the cops ended on the 30th of November 1984. I was suspended, then finally sacked by the April 1986. But in all that time, I was no longer a copper. I was going to court, I was defending myself. And he was going on his merry way. But in that time, he didn't commit any of these armed robberies from 81 and through until 1986. So I don't know how he can say, well, the green light worked for me in 1986. I wasn't there, and I don't know who else was there to help him or look after him. But, of course, to me, it's a fallacy. And everything he said is a lie.
There was a very difficult, extremely difficult time in your life, I guess, when you've mentioned the Michael Drury matter. You were charged with conspiring to murder him.
Yep.
In fact, you were charged with a whole range of matters. Run me through. I mean, it was like charge after charge at one stage. What were you charged with? It was over a fairly brief period of, relatively over a period of years.
Yeah. When I was suspended in November 1984, I was summoned on a charge of attempting to offer Drury a bribe, where the allegation was that he had come to Darlinghurst Police Station at my request, and I had offered him a bribe. Now, I want you to look very carefully at what he says that bribe was. He says that I offered him between $15,000 and $25,000 in regard to his giving evidence in the forthcoming Alan Williams trial in Melbourne. That was it. Now, I want to put this to you. He said I offered him between 15 and 25. Now, did I offer him 16? Did I offer him 20? What was this between? What was it for? And it was never tested. I think it was just accepted, basically, by the jury as being fanciful. Because how can I mean, if I wanted to offer someone a bribe, I'd say, listen, mate, here's 10 grand. Look, how much do you want to do something? Well, I want 10 grand, I want 20 grand, I want 100,000. You don't say, I want between 15 and 25. That doesn't make sense. Now, this is what he said. And he stuck to it. He never changed from it. And he never asked me what I wanted him to do. Now, you'd like to think, if he was this very disgruntled and disgusted young policeman who had been offered a bribe by a senior police officer like myself at the time, you'd say, well, listen, Roger, what do you want done? Well, you're saying 15 to 25. Well, what do I do? What do I get for 25? You know, what do I get for 15? You know, what do I have to do? It was never explained, and that's exactly how it is.
Did you have anything to do with the attempted murder of Michael Drury?
Never at any time did I have anything to do with the attempted murder of Michael Drury. I gave my account of things honestly and truthfully to the investigating police at the time, and I still stand by that to this day.
Tell me what happened in that court case. What was the upshot of that allegation against you?
I was charged with that, as I said, in November '84, and I went to trial in June '85, and I was acquitted. In about August or September, after I was acquitted in 1985, it was announced to the world that the police had uncovered the 2 bank accounts at the National Bank in York Street with 110,000. I was called down to police headquarters and I was questioned as to the circumstance of those monies being in that account. I gave an honest account of where those monies came from. It was corroborated by a friend of mine, but that didn't satisfy them, because that didn't suit the powers that be under Avery. But it's just laid there for the time being. Then I was charged departmentally over going on television and admitting to the world that Ned Smith was an informer. I was charged with having these 2 bank accounts, and I was charged with similar about 5 or 6 of these departmental charges. They put me before a hanging judge named Thorley, Judge Thorley, who only died recently, Thumper Thorley. When I walked into the police tribunal, I realised it was a waste of time me going there. In fact, I spent half a day there. I went back to the engineering business, which I was then running with my partner, and I never went back to the police tribunal again. It was a waste of time, and of course Thorley found me guilty of all these, well, I think he might have acquitted me of one, but found me guilty of all the others and recommended I be sacked. And that's what happened to me. So then things lay dormant, but of course the powers that be were still not happy over the Drury case. So they then put the Omega Task Force together, with Doug Kelly in charge of it, Clive Small, and this other gang of jerks, including Billy Smith. And then they reinvestigated everything again. And then I was charged with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice over the money in the bank accounts. Small had found this Miss Jones, and he got a very long statement of her saying that she had come to Sydney and we'd swapped money for heroin and all that sort of crap. I was also charged by them with conspiracy to murder Drury. The conspiracy trial came up first in the Supreme Court in October of 1989. It went for about 3 weeks. The jury were only out for a very short space of time, and they came in and acquitted me. So again, jury's evidence was not accepted by the jury. The conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, that started off in February, and it was a very long trial, and they called this Miss Jones. He went before a judge who we had asked to disqualify himself because he'd been a Crown prosecutor, knew me personally. He refused to do so. He held the case. He was given the job, and we were found guilty. And then I was sentenced to 8 years. 8 years, six on the bottom, 8 on top, by this Judge Shillington, a vicious judge. And then, of course, we appealed, and in December, the following December of 1990, the Court of Criminal Appeal, in a unanimous decision, acquitted me. So I was released after spending that 9 months in the prison hospital at Long Bay. The Crown then appealed to the High Court. 2 years later, the High Court held that the Court of Criminal Appeal were wrong. It was a 3-2 decision. 3 against me, 2 for me. So it was then remitted back to the Court of Criminal Appeal, who had to use the findings of the High Court, and they then found me guilty. But they sentenced me to 3 years jail, not 6 years. So at that point of time, I had to cop the umpire's decision. So that's when I served that 3 years for conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. It took all those years for that to happen. In the end, after the Court of Criminal Appeal had to reconsider the case with the High Court judgment and their directions, I was then sentenced to 3 years jail on the bottom, and that was basically for this conspiracy to pervert the course of justice which involved the bank accounts and this evidence of Miss Jones, who said that I was dealing in heroin with her or her boyfriend, Dennis Allen. So when I was called back to the Court of Criminal Appeal for their judgment, they found me guilty again of conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. I was taken down into the cells, put straight into a little van and driven straight down to Berrima Prison, Corrective Services, where once I arrived and was processed and allotted a hut, as they called them down there, when I got out into the yard, lo and behold, I was met by 16 other police officers who were already incarcerated there, going from the former Deputy Commissioner, Bill Allen, down to some lowly constable who'd killed a cat or something or other. But there were 16 there, so I had pretty good company. And it was a protection jail. It had policemen, it had lawyers, it had pedophiles, a lot of informers there, and that's the type of jail it was. But the police all stuck together and associated with each other, and it wasn't that bad.
Was it tough inside? Was it humiliating for you to having been a very good detective on the other side, I guess, ending up in that position? How did you feel? It
was extremely humiliating, of course, for this to happen to me. I honestly believe that when I was originally acquitted, that I would stay acquitted, and everyone told me I'd be acquitted. But this is what happens to you sometimes. This is how the law works. Very humiliating, and I felt more sorry for my family than myself, because my daughters then were married, and I had, in fact, my first grandson, my first grandchild was born when I was down there, and of course my older daughter Melinda brought him down, young Josh, and I was very proud, of course, to have him a grandson, but there I was in Berrima Jail. Certainly very humiliating, but you've got to get on with life. If you, and I'm sure they wanted me. I'm sure they thought that I would probably end up in the gutter, that I'd never recover from those circumstances, that I just wouldn't recover and probably neck myself. I'm sure that's what they'd like me to have done. But you've got to get on with life. There's more to life than just that, and so I got on with life.
Looking back on it now, I mean, how would you sum up the career, your career? How would you sum it all up in the police force I'm talking about?
I thought my career was going great guns. I think it was going straight up. And that's how it was. I was still going straight up when I got suspended. I hadn't plateaued. I mean, I'd been transferred to Darlinghurst, but I had been promoted to Detective Sergeant second class, and I was on the border of being promoted to Sergeant first class. Nelson Chadd came along one day and said, "Roger," he said, "we'll both be inspectors before you know it with this new system." I just said, "Oh yeah." But I was still loving my job as the acting boss of Darlinghurst Detectives, and was shocked when I was summoned to police headquarters and served with the summons for attempting to bribe Drury. But I knew at that point, because I knew what Avery's attitude was, I knew what Avery had been saying about people, that that was the end of it. I knew there'd be no comeback. I knew that was it. And that was the case, that was the end of my career. Full stop. It never plateaued. It just was going straight up and suddenly came to a stop and a big crash to the ground.
Where do you think it all went wrong, went pear-shaped? Was it the shooting of Lanfranchi? Was it the Drury matter? Or was it the appointment of Avery? Or a combination? I don't know. Tell me.
I really don't believe that the Lanfranchi case had any bearing on my career. I think that Barney Ross, who was then the Deputy Commissioner, probably was thinking he was doing the right thing by me, by transferring me to Darlinghurst. I was getting fairly senior to be so active as a detective on the street. But I think once I was suspended by Avery, and once I was convicted of the conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, then I was open slather for every journalist and writer and anyone in the world to say what they like, because I was stuffed. My credibility was thrown down the gurgler, and anyone could say anything they like about me. Anyone could write anything they like about me. Blue Murder came along, of course, straight after it. Blue Murder was filmed whilst I was in Berrima Jail, because they knew that I couldn't sue for defamation because my credibility had been shot to pieces.
How does it feel when, and touching on that point, you're frequently described as a notorious or disgraced former detective. How do you feel when you read that, or have you just got a very thick skin?
Over the years, I have become so thick-skinned that when I see notorious, disgraced, jailed, in fact, I often joke that I seriously should consider changing my name by deed poll and include all those names in it, so I could be Roger Caleb, disgraced, jailed, former detective Rogerson. But I haven't got around to doing it yet.
What about regrets? Looking back, any regrets? Anything you would have done differently?
When I look back on my career in the police force, or my life in the police force, I thought that I was doing a great job. From the moment I joined as a cadet, I loved what I did, and I loved being a detective. I loved the camaraderie. I loved working under some of those old blokes I've already talked about: Ray Kelly, Jack McNeil, Matt Carmody, Noel Morey, and others. And I just thought that I fitted in nicely. I could talk to people. I was successful. I was making numerous arrests. I was doing everything that my bosses asked of me. And I was getting accolades. I was getting commendations. I won the Peter Mitchell Award, which is only handed out once a year to one police officer. Occasionally it might be split, but in my year I got it by myself. You don't win that thing without a lot of effort being put into winning it. And I thought that was just a great honour and a great privilege for me to have won it. When it all came crashing down, I just had to accept it. There was this change of hierarchy. I could see it happening. Maybe when John Avery became the police commissioner, I should have applied for a job at headquarters and got a job there, maybe in the building department or the special branch or one of these other little close-knit operations where they all plan their career paths and somehow end up as high-ranking police officers. But I would not have been happy working at police headquarters.
With looking at the police force today, and this is really we're summing it all up. You look at the police force today as compared to what it was when you were in it, in your prime. What's the difference, and how do things need to change from your point of view?
When I was a cop in my day, we all worked together. We had strong bosses. There was a lot of camaraderie. We enjoyed going to work, and we all worked. We all pulled together. From talking to young people in the shows that I do, and not only in this state but in other states, they're all frustrated. They have their bosses are people who have never worked the streets, have no real experience. They've just concentrated on promotion. There are some terrific young people amongst them. I've had many a conversation with them, but they don't have the support which they need to have. But more particularly, people say that today we don't have respect for the police. Well, in my day, the Crims never had respect neither. They had fear of the police force. And young idiots and hoodlums playing up, when the cops came along, they realised they'd be in for it. Now, I have noticed, I've got off the train a number of times at Bankstown Railway Station, and I was there one afternoon, and there were some Vietnamese kids and Lebanese kids and some Islander kids, and there was a huge stouse on the south side of Bankstown Railway Station. The police were there. There was all these young police. All these young hoodlums just yelled abuse. There were some policewomen amongst them, cursed and carried on. I could not believe it. And then ran off, and these cops made no effort to catch any of them. And just walked on. I could not believe it. In my day, all those jerks, we'd have worked out who they were, and when over a period of time, every one of those jerks would have ended up back at Bankstown Police Station in the dock, probably with a sore head, or sore ribs, or a sore something. And that's the trouble today. It's all mollycoddle, and it's all bullshit. We have a government that is as weak as water. They appoint all these government departments, they're all weak, and the police department is just run by yes men. And it flows down to the police, and they know that they don't have any support. If they do anything wrong at all, and they're on a CCTV camera or something, they know they're gone. They know that there will be no support by the superiors. They'll just be told, you shouldn't have done it, and we're going to get rid of you. And that's the problem today. There's no loyalty, and there's no support by their superiors.
How would you like to be remembered?
Well, I think it's how would I like to be remembered? Well, for people who have watched Blue Murder 100 times, that's how they'll remember me. I'm hoping the people who read my book, they'll remember me from some of the things out of that book. I know for a fact that my family will remember me for being a good father. I know that my friends will remember me for being a good mate and with loyalty attached to it. Well, I'd like to be remembered for the good things I did, and I think I did plenty. These other things that happened to me, sure. I regret about those things happening, and I've copped it on the chin. I don't whinge and whine about it. And I'm really hoping that the people who watch this program with an open mind, not a biased mind, will then be able to make up their minds about just who Roger Rogerson was and what he was all about. And I suppose I'll just be remembered maybe like Frank Sinatra's song. I did it my way. And that's all I can say.
Diamonds in his eyes, kind that you can't see inside your disguise. It's where he wants to be. You think that you're so smart with everything you say, that he can feel your heart, every game you play. Don't talk so loud, you are so